Some discoveries don't just raise questions. They don't leave you a frozen lake filled with skeletons. Massive stone structures built with precision. We still can't fully explain skulls, objects, and places that don't quite fit into what we think we know. These aren't stories. They were found studied and still not fully understood. In this video, we're exploring some of the most mysterious discoveries ever uncovered, from hidden tombs and strange burials to structures and artifacts that continue to challenge our understanding of the past. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if this kind of mystery pulls you in, make sure to subscribe, because some of these discoveries stay with you long after the video ends. The lake where hundreds were left behind, skeletons of Rupkund Lake. At first it feels like nothing unusual. A small lake, high in the mountains, surrounded by rock, snow, and silence. A place that doesn't immediately suggest anything beyond isolation. The kind of environment where very little changes. Where the landscape feels still, almost untouched. But that changes when the ice melts, because beneath the surface something begins to appear. Bones. Not one or two, but many. Scattered along the edges, resting beneath the water. Emerging gradually as the frozen layer clears, revealing what had been hidden for most of the year. This is Rupkund Lake. And what makes it different is not just the presence of human remains, but the number, because this is not a single burial. Not a structured site with defined graves, but a location where dozens, possibly hundreds of individuals were left in the same place without clear organization. And that immediately raises a question, because places like this do not exist without reason. The location itself is difficult. High altitude, thin air, a place that requires effort to reach even today. Meaning that anyone who arrived here did so intentionally. They came with purpose, with direction, not by accident. And yet, they did not leave. The remains show variation, different ages, different individuals. Not a single group in the simplest sense, but a collection that suggests something more complex, something that may have unfolded over time or involved multiple events. And that complexity becomes clearer when the bones are studied, because many of the skulls show similar patterns, rounded fractures, damage that appears consistent across multiple individuals, suggesting impact from above rather than from ground-level conflict. And that detail shifts the focus, because now the question is not only who they were, but what happened to them. One explanation points to environment, a sudden event. Because in a place like this, conditions can change rapidly. Storms can form without warning, turning an already harsh environment into something far more dangerous. And at this altitude, exposure becomes critical. But even that explanation does not fully resolve everything. Because the pattern of injuries suggests something more specific than gradual exposure, something that affected multiple individuals in a similar way, within a short period of time. And that introduces uncertainty, because it suggests that whatever happened here was not random. It followed a pattern. The lake itself contributes to preservation, cold temperatures, ice covering the surface for most of the year, slowing decomposition, allowing remains to persist far longer than they would in other environments. And that preservation is why the site still exists in this form, why the bones are still visible, why the pattern can still be observed. Even now when the ice recedes, the remains appear again, not as a one-time discovery, but as something that returns, year after year, revealing the same scene, the same unanswered questions. The surrounding terrain adds another layer. Steep, rocky, not suited for large groups to remain for extended periods, which makes the number of individuals even more unusual. Because sustaining that many people in this environment would require preparation, planning, resources. And that raises another question. Why were they here? Were they traveling? Moving through the region as part of a larger route? Gathering for a purpose that required reaching this location? There are possibilities, but no single explanation that fully accounts for everything. And that is what keeps the site unresolved. because each piece of evidence explains part of the story, but not all of it. Even now, standing near the lake, the stillness remains. The surface calm, the surroundings quiet. But beneath that calm, the presence is still there. The remains. The pattern, the unanswered questions. And that contrast is what defines it. Because it looks like a natural place, but it holds something that does not fully belong in this form. Not in this number. Not in this arrangement. And maybe that is what makes Rupkund stand out. Not just because of what was found, but because of what still isn't fully explained. A place where the evidence is clear, but the story is not. And that gap is what remains. The structure built below ground level, Osirian. At first it doesn't stand out, because most of it isn't visible. From above, there is no towering structure, no clear outline that immediately defines its scale, only a sunken area near a well-known temple complex, something that feels secondary at first glance. But that impression changes the moment you move closer, because this is not an extension. It is something entirely different. This is the Osirian, and what makes it unusual is not just how it was built, but where. Because instead of rising above the ground, it descends below it, creating a structure that exists beneath the surface rather than on top of it. And that shift in direction matters. Because building downward changes the entire approach to construction. It requires excavation first, then placement, then alignment within a space that is already enclosed by the earth itself. And that creates a different kind of structure. The materials used here are massive, large stone blocks, carefully shaped, placed with precision to form walls that are thick, stable, and aligned in a way that feels deliberate rather than improvised. And that precision is visible, because the stones fit together tightly, forming surfaces that appear controlled, balanced, and structured. But what stands out is the scale of these blocks, because they are not small, they are heavy, requiring coordination to move, to position, to place accurately within a confined space. And that effort suggests planning, because this is not something that can be assembled gradually without direction. It requires a system. The layout of the Osirian is also distinct. A central chamber surrounded by a series of corridors and spaces, forming a structure that feels enclosed, contained, separated from the outside environment in a way that creates a clear boundary. And that boundary is reinforced by depth, because being below ground naturally isolates the structure. You're reducing external influence, creating an environment that is more stable, more controlled. Water is another key element, because the central area often contains water, either naturally accumulated or influenced by the surrounding conditions, creating a space where stone and water interact within the structure. And that interaction adds another layer, because it changes how the space is experienced. It introduces reflection, movement, variation within an otherwise solid environment. The alignment of the structure also reflects precision, because the placement of walls, the direction of corridors, the positioning of the central chamber all follow a pattern that suggests intentional design rather than random construction. And that design indicates understanding, because aligning elements within a confined below-ground space requires planning before construction begins. But what makes the Osirian particularly interesting is how different it feels from surrounding structures. Because while nearby temples rise upward, using columns and open spaces to create height and visibility, this structure moves in the opposite direction, downward, enclosed, hidden. And that contrast suggests that its purpose was not the same. It served a different function. But what that function was exactly is not fully agreed upon. Because while the structure is clear, the full context is not completely preserved. Some interpretations connect it to symbolic or ritual use. Others focus on its architectural features. But no single explanation fully defines it. And that uncertainty is what gives it depth, because it shows that even when the structure is visible, the meaning can remain open. Even now, standing within the Osirian, the atmosphere is different. The light reduced, the space enclosed. the massive stones surrounding you in a way that feels controlled, almost isolated from the outside world. And that experience is part of the structure, because it is only about what it is, but how it is encountered. The durability of the construction is also evident, because despite its depth, despite environmental factors, the structure remains, its form still intact, its layout still readable, showing that the methods used were effective. But there are still questions. Because while we can see how it was built, we do not fully know why it was built in this exact way. Why this scale was chosen, why this location was used. And that gap remains between structure and meaning. But the evidence is clear. The blocks, the layout, the depth. All of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not a simple extension of another structure. It is a separate system, built differently, designed differently, functioning in a way that is not immediately comparable. And maybe that is what makes the Assyrian stand out. Not because it is hidden, but because it is built in a way that contrasts everything around it. A structure that does not rise into view, but descends into something quieter, something more controlled. And that depth is what remains. The skulls that don't match what we expect. Parika's elongated skulls. At first, it looks like variation. A difference in shape that could be explained. Something that feels unusual but not impossible. Because human features can change slightly. Forms can shift, and not everything that looks different is outside expectation. But this is not slight. The skulls are elongated, extended far beyond the proportions we normally see, with a shape that continues backward in a way that immediately stands out, something that feels structured rather than accidental. And that is where the question begins. Because this is not a single example, it is a pattern. These are the Parika's elongated skulls, found in burial sites along the coast of Peru, associated with an ancient culture that developed long before many later civilizations in the region. And what makes them significant is not just their form, but how consistently that form appears across multiple individuals. And consistency changes everything, because one example could be dismissed, but many suggest intention. One explanation is cranial modification, a process where the shape of the skull is altered during early development, when the bone is still forming, using external pressure applied over time to guide growth into a desired form. And this practice is known. It appears in different cultures, used for identity, for status, for distinction within a group. And that explanation accounts for the shape. It explains how elongation could be achieved. But it does not resolve everything, because when these skulls are studied in more detail, some features remain difficult to fully explain through modification alone. The volume, the proportions, elements that do not always align perfectly with what is expected. And that introduces uncertainty, because it suggests that while modification may be part of the explanation, it may not be the entire explanation. The burial context adds another layer. Because these skulls were not found randomly. They were placed carefully within tombs, alongside textiles, artifacts, and objects that reflect a structured burial practice, indicating that these individuals were part of a system, part of a society with defined customs. And that structure matters, because it shows that this was not accidental. It was integrated, part of how identity was expressed even after death. The textiles found with these burials are detailed, complex, showing a high level of craftsmanship, suggesting that the culture placed importance on form, on presentation, on how things were made and displayed. And that attention to detail connects to the skulls, because it shows that shaping, whether in objects or in the human form, may have been part of a broader system of expression, but the exact meaning is not fully preserved. Because while we can observe the results, we do not have direct records explaining why this specific form was chosen, what it represented, how it was perceived within the culture itself. And that leaves space for interpretation, for multiple possibilities. Even now, when these skulls are examined, the reaction is immediate, because the shape stands out. It challenges expectation. It creates a sense that something does not align with what we assume. And that reaction keeps the subject active, because it continues to raise questions. The environment where they were found contributes to preservation. Dry conditions, stable burial environments, allowing both bone and textiles to survive longer than they would in other regions. And that preservation allows for detailed study. But study does not always lead to complete answers, because some aspects remain open. The consistency, the variation within that consistency, the differences that do not fully align. All of these create a space where explanation is possible, but not complete. And that incompleteness is what defines the subject, because it is not a lack of evidence. It is a gap between evidence and full understanding. The skulls remain, the shapes unchanged, the pattern still visible. And that persistence shows that this was not temporary. It was maintained, repeated, sustained across time. And that level of repetition suggests intention, a deliberate choice carried out across generations. And maybe that is what makes the Paracas skulls stand out. Not just because they look different, but because that difference was created, maintained, and preserved in a way that still challenges how we interpret it today. A pattern we can clearly see, but not fully explain. And that uncertainty is what remains. The landscape covered in stone containers, with no clear purpose, the plain of jars. At first it feels scattered. Large stone shapes resting across open ground, placed irregularly across hills and fields, with no walls connecting them. No obvious structure tying them together, just individual forms standing alone, but then you realize how many there are. And the pattern begins to shift, because this is not a small group, it is hundreds, possibly thousands, spread across multiple sites, and that scale changes everything. This is the plain of jars, and what makes it different is not just the size of the objects, but their distribution, because they are not concentrated in one place. They are spread across the landscape in a way that suggests something organized, even if that organization is not immediately visible. Each jar is carved from stone, large, hollow, with openings at the top, shaped in a way that suggests containment, as if they were designed to hold something. But what that something was is not fully agreed upon, and that uncertainty defines the site, because the form is clear, but the function is not. The jars vary in size, some smaller, some large enough to hold significant volume, and that variation suggests that they were not all created for a single uniform purpose, but possibly adapted for different uses, or created at different times with slightly different intentions. And that introduces complexity, because it shows that the system is not fixed, it evolves. The material itself is heavy, stone that had to be shaped, transported, and positioned, requiring effort, coordination, and planning, especially given the number of jars and the distances between them. And that effort suggests intention, because creating one would require work. Creating hundreds requires organization. The placement of the jars is also significant, because they are often positioned on elevated ground along ridges and hills locations that provide visibility across the surrounding area, suggesting that placement was not random but chosen with awareness of the landscape. And that awareness reflects planning, because it shows that the builders were considering not only the objects themselves, but where they would be placed. But what they were used for remains uncertain. Some interpretations suggest burial, that the jars may have been used in processes related to human remains, possibly as part of rituals or practices that are not fully preserved. Others suggest storage, practical use, but no single explanation fully accounts for all aspects of the site. And that lack of a definitive answer keeps the question open, because the jars exist, clearly, but their exact purpose remains unclear. Even the arrangement between jars does not always follow a strict pattern. In some areas, they are grouped closely. In others, more spread out. And that variation suggests that the placement may have developed over time rather than being executed in a single phase. And that introduces the idea of continuity, because it shows that the site may have been revisited, expanded, modified, with new jars added alongside older ones. Even now, the jars remain, weathered, some damaged, some still intact, but enough to show their original form, enough to reveal the pattern, enough to maintain the presence of the site. And that persistence is important, because it allows the system to be studied, observed, questioned. The surrounding environment also plays a role, because the jars interact with the terrain, positioned in ways that follow the natural contours, creating a relationship between object and landscape that feels integrated rather than imposed. And that integration reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders were not working against the environment. They were working within it. But there are still questions, because while the physical evidence is clear, the full context is not. The exact process used to create and transport the jars, the reason for their number, the meaning behind their placement. All of these remain partially unknown. And that uncertainty is what defines the plane of jars, because it is not about whether the site was intentional. That is clear. It is about why. And that question remains open. The jars stand. The pattern exists. The landscape holds them. And maybe that is what makes this place stand out. Not because of a single structure, but because of how many objects come together to form something that feels organized, deliberate, and still not fully explained. A landscape shaped by placement. A system that we can see, but not fully understand. And that mystery is what remains. Is what the lines that stretch across an entire landscape, Sajama lines. At first they are almost invisible. From the ground, they don't stand out as structures. There are no walls, no stones rising above the surface, only faint paths cutting across the land, lines so subtle that they seem natural, almost like trails formed over time. But the moment you see them from above, everything changes. Because they are not random, they are straight. Extremely straight. Extending across the landscape in lines that continue for kilometers, crossing hills, valleys, and uneven terrain without breaking direction. These are the Sajama lines. And what makes them different is not just their form, but their scale. Because there are thousands of them, forming a network that spreads across a vast area, creating a pattern that only becomes fully visible when seen from a distance. Each line is created by clearing the surface, removing darker material to reveal lighter ground beneath, forming paths that are defined not by addition, but by subtraction, a method that requires consistency to maintain straightness over long distances. And that consistency is what stands out, because maintaining a straight line across uneven terrain is not simple. It requires direction, alignment, an understanding of how to extend a path without deviation. And that suggests planning, because these lines do not wander. They do not curve. They remain steady. But what they connect is not always clear. Because while some lines lead to points that appear significant, others continue across open space, intersecting with other lines, forming a network that feels structured, but not immediately explainable. And that complexity adds another layer, because it shows that this is not a single system with a single function. It is something broader. The sheer number of lines suggests repetition, because creating one line would require effort. Creating thousands requires coordination over time, a process that extends beyond a single event, and that introduces continuity, because it shows that the lines may have been created gradually, added over time, expanding the network as it developed. The environment plays a role in their preservation. Dry conditions, minimal vegetation, allowing the lines to remain visible, to persist without being erased by growth or erosion. And that preservation is why the pattern still exists today. But the purpose remains uncertain. Some interpretations suggest movement, paths used for travel, but the precision and scale suggest something more than practical routes. Others suggest symbolic or ritual significance. Lines that mark space, define direction. But no single explanation fully accounts for all aspects. And that uncertainty is what defines the Sajama lines, because they are clearly intentional, clearly structured, yet not fully understood. Even now, when viewed from above, the network becomes clear, lines intersecting, running parallel, extending outward in multiple directions, creating a visual system that feels organized, even if the meaning behind it is not fully known. And that visibility from above introduces another question. Because while the lines can be followed from the ground, their full pattern is only visible from a higher perspective. And that raises the idea that the design may not have been meant to be understood from a single point, but from the system as a whole. The interaction with the landscape also stands out, because the lines do not avoid terrain. They cross it, maintaining direction even when the ground changes, suggesting that alignment was prioritized over ease. And that prioritization reflects intention, because it shows that the builders were focused on maintaining the pattern, even when it required additional effort. But there are still unanswered questions. Because while the structure is visible, the full context is not. The reason for the scale, the meaning behind the network, the purpose of specific alignments, all of these remain open. And that openness is what keeps the site active in discussion, because it exists as evidence without a complete explanation. A system without a fully defined purpose. The lines remain, the pattern continues, the landscape holds them. And maybe that is what makes the Sajama lines stand out. Not because they are immediately visible, but because they reveal themselves only when you see the bigger picture. A network that exists across space. A system that is precise, repeated, and still not fully explained. And that pattern is what remains. The tool found locked inside stone. The London hammer. At first, it doesn't seem unusual. A hammer. A simple tool, something familiar, something that fits easily into what we understand. A shaped head attached to a handle. Nothing about it immediately suggesting anything outside the ordinary. But then you notice where it was found. Encased. Partially embedded within a rock formation. Surrounded by material that appears solid, as if the object had become part of the stone itself. And that is where the question begins. Because tools are not supposed to be inside rock, at least not in this way. This is often referred to as the London hammer. And what makes it stand out is not the object itself, but the context in which it was discovered, because the surrounding material suggests age, while the object appears more recent in design, and that contrast creates tension, because it suggests a mismatch between object and environment. The hammerhead is made of metal, shaped, functional, with characteristics that align with tools used for striking, for shaping, for work that involves impact, and that familiarity is what makes it easier to recognize. But the surrounding rock complicates that recognition, because it appears to have formed around the object, enclosing part of it, creating the impression that the hammer was present before the stone hardened. And that implication raises a question, because it suggests a timeline that does not align easily. But understanding this requires looking at formation processes, because rock can form in different ways. Not all stone is ancient in the same sense. Some formations develop more quickly under certain conditions, creating material that appears solid and aged, even if it formed around an existing object. And that possibility introduces explanation, because it shows that the presence of an object within stone does not automatically mean that the object is as old as the stone appears, but that does not fully resolve the curiosity, because the visual effect remains a tool, partially enclosed. A combination that feels out of place. The handle of the hammer also adds another layer, because it appears preserved to some extent, suggesting that the conditions within the surrounding material, limited exposure, slowed decay, allowed parts of the organic material to remain. And that preservation reflects environment, because certain conditions can protect materials in ways that extend their lifespan. But the key detail is still the relationship between object and rock, because it creates a moment where expectation is challenged, where something familiar is placed in an unfamiliar context, creating a question that feels larger than the object itself. And that question is not only about age, it is about process. How did this combination form? What conditions allowed this to happen? And how should it be interpreted? The discovery itself is often discussed in different ways. Some interpretations emphasize the unusual nature of the find. Others focus on geological explanations, suggesting that the rock formed around the object over time. And that difference in interpretation shows how the same evidence can lead to different conclusions. But what remains consistent is the object itself. The hammer, the rock, the combination. Because regardless of interpretation, the physical presence is clear. Even now, when examined, the object still creates the same reaction, because it looks familiar, but placed in a way that feels unexpected. And that contrast is what keeps it relevant, because it challenges immediate assumptions. The scale of the object is not large, but its impact is not based on size, it is based on context. Because it takes something ordinary and places it within something that appears extraordinary. And that shift in context is what creates the question. But there are still uncertainties, because without complete documentation of the exact conditions at the time of discovery, without full context of the surrounding environment at that moment, some aspects remain open. And that openness allows for different interpretations, different perspectives. But the object remains, the hammer still exists, the rock still surrounds it, the combination still visible. And maybe that is what makes the London hammer stand out, not because it provides a clear answer, but because it presents a situation where the answer is not immediately obvious. A familiar object, in an unfamiliar setting. And that contrast is what remains. The underground structure built with precision. Hypogum of Halsaflieni. At first, there is almost nothing to see. From the surface, it looks like an ordinary part of the landscape, with no towering structure, no visible walls, nothing that suggests the complexity hidden below, which makes the experience of entering it feel unexpected, almost like stepping into something that was never meant to be immediately visible. But once you move underground, the space begins to open. Rooms appear, passages extend, chambers connect in ways that reveal a structure that is not random, but carefully shaped, forming a system that was clearly planned before it was created. This is the Hypogum of Halsaflieni. And what makes it different is not just that it exists underground, but how precisely it was carved, because this is not a natural cave that was adapted. It is a structure that was intentionally cut into the rock, shaping space in a way that mirrors construction above ground, but executed entirely below it. The material is limestone, soft enough to carve but stable enough to hold form, allowing walls, ceilings, and openings to be shaped with control, creating surfaces that feel deliberate rather than irregular. And that control is visible throughout. Because the chambers are not uneven or accidental, they follow forms that suggest design, with rounded edges, defined doorways, and spaces that feel proportioned rather than hollowed out without direction. The layout is layered, different levels connected vertically, creating a structure that extends downward in stages, rather than existing as a single flat space, which adds complexity, because movement is not just forward and backward, but also up and down within the underground environment, and that vertical layering requires planning, because each level must align with the others, each chamber positioned in relation to the rest, ensuring that the structure remains stable while still allowing movement between spaces. Some chambers are larger, open enough to hold multiple individuals, while others are smaller, more enclosed, creating variation within the structure, suggesting that different spaces served different purposes rather than all being used in the same way. And that variation reflects organization, because it shows that the builders were not simply creating space, they were defining how that space would function. The entrances to these chambers are shaped, not just openings, but forms that resemble doorways, even though they do not function as doors in the traditional sense, creating a transition between spaces that feels intentional, marking movement from one area to another. And that transition matters, because it changes how the space is experienced, creating a sense of progression as you move deeper into the structure. The walls also show signs of finishing. Surfaces that appear smoothed, areas that reflect attention to detail, indicating that the structure was not only carved, but refined after the initial shaping. And that refinement suggests care, because it shows that the builders were concerned with how the space looked and felt, not just how it functioned. Sound behaves differently inside. The enclosed spaces, the shape of the chambers, the material itself all contribute to how sound moves, creating echoes that travel in specific ways, adding another dimension to the environment. And that acoustic quality is noticeable, because it changes how the space is experienced, how voices carry, how sound interacts with the structure. The purpose of the hypodrome is connected to burial. Human remains were placed within these chambers, indicating that the structure was used as a space for the dead, but not in a simple or uniform way, because the layout suggests repeated use, multiple phases, a process that continued over time. And that repetition creates continuity, because it shows that the site was revisited, maintained, used across generations, becoming part of an ongoing system rather than a single event. The underground nature of the structure creates separation. It removes the space from everyday visibility, placing it beneath the surface, making access intentional, controlled, something that requires effort. And that separation reflects purpose, because it suggests that the space was meant to be distinct from daily life. Even now, moving through the hypodrome, the structure remains clear. The chamber is still connected. The layout still readable, allowing the system to be understood even after long periods. But there are still questions, because while the physical structure is visible, the full meaning behind it is not completely preserved. The specific rituals, the beliefs that guided its design, the reasons for certain features, all of these remain partially unknown. And that uncertainty is part of the site, because it shows that even when the structure remains, the full context can fade. But the evidence is still strong. The carving, the layout, the precision, all of it shows intention, planning, execution, because this is not a natural space that was used. It is a constructed environment, deliberately shaped, designed to function in a specific way. And maybe that is what makes the hypodrome stand out. Not because it is hidden, but because of how carefully it was created, how the underground space was transformed into something structured, something organized, something that still holds its form today. A place built beneath the surface, with a level of control that is still visible. And that precision is what remains. The metal object found where it shouldn't be, IU'd aluminum wedge. At first, it doesn't look significant. A small metal object shaped unevenly, with a form that doesn't immediately suggest a clear purpose, something that could easily be overlooked without context, just another fragment among many. But the context is what changes everything, because this object was found buried in sediment, alongside materials that suggest age, creating a situation where the object and its surroundings don't seem to match in a straightforward way. This is often referred to as the IU'd aluminum wedge. And what makes it stand out is not its shape alone, but the material. Because aluminum is not typically associated with very early periods, requiring processes that involve extraction and refinement methods that are relatively advanced. And that contrast creates the question. Because the presence of aluminum in a context that appears older introduces a gap between expectation and observation. The object itself has a distinct form, wedge-like, with surfaces that show shaping, edges that appear worked rather than natural, suggesting that it was created for a purpose, even if that purpose is not immediately clear. And that purpose is part of the mystery, because without a defined function, the object becomes harder to place within a known system. The surface of the metal shows signs of oxidation, a layer that forms over time, indicating that the object has been exposed to conditions that allowed this process to occur, adding another element to its history, another factor to consider when understanding how long it has been where it was found. But oxidation alone does not define age precisely. It indicates exposure, not exact time. And that distinction matters, because it shows that interpreting the object requires more than a single observation. The surrounding material where the wedge was discovered plays a role, because it provides context. Sediment, layers that suggest deposition over time, creating the impression that the object was embedded within a natural process rather than placed recently. And that impression is what raises the question. Because if the object was present during the formation of those layers, it suggests a timeline that does not align easily with what we expect. But understanding sediment is complex because layers can shift, objects can move, processes can occur that place items in positions that do not reflect their original time of use, and that possibility introduces alternative explanations, because it shows that the relationship between object and environment is not always straightforward. The material itself, aluminum, requires attention, because it is not found in its pure form naturally. It must be processed, refined, and that process involves knowledge, tools, systems that are part of more developed technological stages. And that is where the contrast becomes more noticeable, because the object appears shaped, while the context suggests age, and those two elements do not immediately align. The shape of the wedge also suggests function, because wedges are typically used for splitting, for separating materials, for applying force in a controlled way, meaning that the object likely had a practical use rather than being purely decorative. And that practical nature adds another layer, because it places the object within activity, within use, within a system where tools are required, but without clear association to a specific tool set or structure. Its exact role remains uncertain, and that uncertainty keeps the object open to interpretation. Some perspectives focus on the unusual aspects, the material, the context. Others emphasize geological and environmental explanations, suggesting that the conditions of discovery may not represent the original timeline of the object. And that difference in interpretation shows how evidence can be understood in multiple ways. But the physical object remains. The wedge, the metal, the shape, all of it visible, all of it present. Even now the object continues to be examined, studied, discussed, because it sits at a point where expectation is challenged, where something familiar appears in a setting that does not fully match. And that contrast is what keeps it relevant, because it raises a question that is not easily dismissed, but also not fully resolved. The scale of the object is small, but its significance is not based on size, it is based on context, because it represents a situation where understanding requires more than surface observation, where interpretation depends on how different pieces of information are connected. But those connections are not always complete, and that incompleteness is what defines it, because it leaves space for different explanations, for continued discussion, for analysis that evolves over time, and maybe that is what makes the IU'd aluminum wedge stand out. Not because it provides a clear answer, but because it presents a combination that does not immediately fit. A material, a form, a context that together create a question that remains open. A small object, in a setting that feels out of place, and that contrast is what remains. The structure found resting on the ocean floor, Baltic Sea anomaly. At first, it doesn't look like a structure, just a shape. A formation detected through sonar, resting deep beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea, where visibility is limited and direct observation is difficult, making the initial discovery feel more like a signal than a clear image. But the shape stands out because it doesn't follow the usual patterns expected from natural formations, appearing more defined, more structured, with edges and surfaces that suggest something beyond randomness. This is known as the Baltic Sea anomaly, and what makes it different is not just its appearance, but how it was found, because the first indication came through scanning technology, revealing an outline that immediately raised questions before anyone had physically reached it. And that kind of discovery changes how it is understood, because instead of being seen directly, it is interpreted through data first, through signals, through images that represent the object rather than show it clearly. And that introduces uncertainty from the beginning, because interpretation becomes part of the process. The structure itself appears circular, with features that suggest elevation in certain areas, depressions in others, creating a form that feels uneven, but not entirely random, as if it follows a pattern that is not immediately obvious. And that ambiguity is important, because it allows for multiple interpretations. Some features appear smooth, others rough, creating contrast across the surface that makes it difficult to classify using a single description. And that complexity adds to the uncertainty. The environment plays a major role, because the Baltic Sea is not a clear, open body of water. It contains sediment, limited visibility, conditions that make direct observation difficult, meaning that much of what is known comes from indirect methods, from scans, from measurements, from brief explorations. And that limitation affects understanding, because without continuous, clear observation, conclusions remain tentative. The scale of the anomaly also contributes to its significance, because it is not a small object. It occupies space, large enough to be detected clearly through scanning, large enough to suggest that whatever it is, it was not formed on a small scale. And that scale raises questions about formation, because creating something of that size requires processes that are either natural over long periods or constructed through coordinated effort. But distinguishing between those possibilities is not simple, because underwater environments can produce formations that appear structured, shaped by erosion, pressure, and sediment movement over time, creating patterns that resemble intentional design. And that possibility must be considered. At the same time, certain aspects of the shape appear unusual, edges that seem more defined than expected, surfaces that appear smoother in some areas. And these features contribute to the ongoing discussion, because they do not fit easily into a single explanation. Even attempts to explore the site directly have faced challenges: limited visibility, difficult conditions, making detailed study slow and complex, meaning that each new piece of information adds to the understanding, but does not fully resolve it. And that gradual accumulation of data reflects the nature of the site, because it is not something that can be fully understood in a single observation. It requires time, multiple approaches, different methods, but even with these efforts, the full explanation remains open, because the available evidence supports multiple interpretations, natural formation, unusual geological structure, or something that has not yet been fully categorized. And that range of possibilities is what defines the anomaly, because it sits between categories, not clearly fitting into one. The location itself adds another layer, because being underwater changes how structures are preserved, how they are altered, how they are discovered, meaning that the context is different from sites on land. And that difference affects interpretation, because processes that occur underwater can produce results that are not immediately comparable to those on land. Even now, the anomaly remains, resting on the ocean floor, partially understood, continuing to be studied, and that persistence keeps the question active, because it shows that the object, whatever it is, exists clearly enough to be detected, but not clearly enough to be fully explained. And maybe that is what makes the Baltic Sea anomaly stand out. Not because it provides a clear answer, but because it exists in a space where interpretation is still ongoing, where evidence is visible, but conclusions are not final. A shape beneath the water, a structure that is seen, but not fully understood, and that uncertainty is what remains. The skull that doesn't fully match expectations, the star child skull. At first, it looks like a human skull. The general structure is familiar with recognizable features that align with what we expect. A rounded form, eye sockets, a shape that fits within known anatomy, making the initial impression feel ordinary. But that changes the longer you look at it, because the proportions begin to shift. The skull appears larger in certain areas, the shape extending in ways that feel different from typical variation, creating a form that stands out, not dramatically at first, but enough to raise questions. This is often referred to as the star child skull, and what makes it notable is not just its appearance, but how it has been interpreted, because it sits in a space where observation is clear, but explanation is debated. The structure of the skull shows differences. The cranial vault appears expanded. The proportions do not align perfectly with average human measurements, suggesting either an unusual condition or a form of variation that is not commonly encountered. And that is where the uncertainty begins. Because variation exists, human anatomy can differ, conditions can affect growth, altering shape in ways that may seem unusual but still fall within biological possibility. And that explanation must be considered. At the same time, certain features of the skull have been described as distinct. The thickness of bone in some areas, the shape of the eye sockets, elements that do not immediately align with common expectations. And these features contribute to ongoing discussion, because they create a situation where the skull does not fit easily into a simple category. The context of discovery adds another layer, because the skull was not found in isolation. It was part of a burial context associated with other remains, indicating that it belonged to an individual who lived within a human environment, within a cultural setting, not separate from it. And that connection matters, because it anchors the skull within a known framework. But even within that framework, the differences remain, and those differences are what draw attention, because they create a contrast between what is familiar and what is not. The process of analysis involves measurement, comparison, looking at the skull in relation to the known samples, identifying similarities and differences, trying to determine whether the features can be explained through known conditions or whether they require a different interpretation. And that process is ongoing, because interpretation can change as new information becomes available. Different perspectives exist. Some emphasize biological explanations, conditions that could account for the shape. Others focus on the unusual aspects, highlighting features that seem difficult to fully explain through known variations. And that range of perspectives reflects the nature of the subject, because it is not fully settled, but the physical object remains. The skull is real. It can be examined, measured, studied, and that allows for continued analysis. Even now, when viewed, the skull creates a reaction, because it appears both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And that combination is what makes it compelling, because it sits between categories, not clearly fitting into one. The preservation of the skull also contributes to its study, because the material has remained intact enough to allow detailed observation, providing data that can be analyzed, compared, interpreted. But data does not always lead to a single conclusion, because interpretation depends on context, on comparison, on how different pieces of information are connected. And those connections are not always complete, and that incompleteness is what defines the subject, because it leaves space for different explanations, for continued discussion, for analysis that evolves over time. But what remains consistent is the presence of the skull itself. The shape, the proportions, the features that stand out, all of it visible, all of it real. And maybe that is what makes the star child skull stand out. Not because it provides a clear answer, but because it presents a form that challenges immediate understanding, something that looks close to what we expect, but not entirely the same. A familiar structure, with unfamiliar details. And that contrast is what remains. The perfect stone shapes that shouldn't be this precise spheres. At first they seem too simple, just round stones resting on the ground, smooth and quiet, without carvings, without markings, without anything that immediately explains why they were made. But the longer you look, the more the simplicity becomes the question, because these are not just as stones, they are spheres, and not rough approximations, but shapes that approach near perfect roundness, with surfaces that appear intentionally smoothed, creating a form that feels controlled rather than natural. These are the Dickey's spheres, and what makes them stand out is not only their shape, but their precision, because creating a sphere from stone is not straightforward, especially when the result maintains consistency across multiple examples. And there are many, different sizes, some small, others large enough to dominate the space around them, each one following the same fundamental form, suggesting that this was not a one-time effort but a repeated process, and repetition changes the meaning, because it shows that the method was known, understood, used again and again. The material itself varies. Some spheres are made from harder stone, requiring more effort to shape, more time to refine, which indicates that the process was not accidental, but deliberate, requiring planning and execution. And that effort suggests importance, because shaping stone into a sphere requires removing material evenly from all sides, maintaining balance, ensuring that the form remains consistent as it is refined. And that level of control is not simple. The surfaces of many spheres are smooth, not perfectly polished in every case, but refined enough to show that attention was given to the final form, suggesting that appearance mattered, that the shape itself was the focus. And that focus raises a question. Why a sphere? Because a sphere is not the easiest shape to create. It does not provide obvious practical advantages in the way other shapes might, and that suggests that the purpose may not have been purely functional. The placement of the spheres also varies. Some are found individually, others in groups, sometimes aligned, sometimes scattered. And that variation suggests that their arrangement may have changed over time, or that different spheres serve different roles depending on their location. And that adds complexity, because it shows that the system is not uniform. It adapts. Some interpretations suggest that the spheres may have been markers, placed to define space, to indicate positions. Others suggest symbolic meaning, but no single explanation fully accounts for all aspects. And that lack of a clear purpose keeps the question open, because the form is obvious, but the function is not. The process of creating these spheres also requires consideration, because shaping large stone objects would involve tools, techniques, methods that allow gradual refinement, removing material in stages, adjusting the form until the desired shape is achieved. And that process requires time, patience, consistency. Because a sphere cannot be rushed, it must be developed step by step. And that process reflects knowledge, because it shows that the builders understood how to work with the material, how to achieve the form they intended. Even now, when these spheres are observed, the reaction is immediate, because the shape is familiar, perfect, but placed in a context that raises questions. And that contrast is what keeps them relevant, because they challenge expectations. The environment where they are found also contributes to their presence, because over time, vegetation, soil, and movement have affected their positions, meaning that what we see now may not fully represent their original arrangement. And that adds uncertainty, because it means that part of the context may have changed, but the spheres themselves remain, their shape unchanged, their form still visible. And that persistence is important, because it allows the object to be studied even when the full context is not preserved. The scale of some spheres also adds impact, because larger examples require more effort, more coordination, suggesting that the process was not limited to small objects, but extended to larger forms as well. And that extension reflects capability, because it shows that the method could be applied at different scales. But there are still unanswered questions. Because while we can see how the spheres were made in general terms, we do not fully know why they were made in this exact form, why this shape was chosen, why this many were created. And that gap remains, between observation and full understanding. But the evidence is clear. The spheres exist. The shape is precise. The repetition is visible. And that combination shows intention, planning, execution. Because this is not random stone. Formation. It is created, deliberate, consistent. And maybe that is what makes the decayed spheres stand out. Not because they are complex, but because they are simple, in a way that is difficult to achieve, a perfect form, repeated across a landscape and still not fully explained. And that precision is what remains the rock that looks like it was engineered, waffle rock. At first, it feels too structured to be natural. A flat rock surface covered in a grid-like pattern, lines crossing at near right angles, forming shapes that resemble a man-made design, something that looks planned rather than formed over time. And that immediate impression is what draws attention, because patterns like this are usually associated with construction, with tools, with intention. This is often called waffle rock. And what makes it stand out is not just the pattern itself, but how precise it appears, because the lines create a repeated grid across the surface, dividing the rock into smaller sections that feel measured, almost as if they follow a design rather than random formation. And that precision raises a question, because natural processes are often irregular. They vary, they shift, but this pattern feels consistent enough to suggest control. The surface of the rock shows intersecting ridges, raised lines forming the grid, with lower sections in between, creating a contrast that enhances the pattern, making it more visible, more defined. And that definition is what creates the impression of structure, because it resembles something we associate with human-made surfaces, tiles, blocks, arranged in a repeated format, but the material is natural stone, and that introduces complexity. Because it means that the explanation must account for how natural processes could produce something that looks so organized. Geological processes can create patterns, cracking, pressure, expansion, and contraction over time. These processes can form lines, intersections, but they usually do not produce perfect grids. And that is where the discussion begins. Because waffle rock sits in that space, between natural formation and visual similarity to design. The environment where it is found also matters, because conditions such as temperature changes, stress within the rock, and within the chemical processes can influence how surfaces break, how patterns develop, shaping the final appearance over long periods. And that influence can create forms that appear structured. But even with these explanations, the pattern still feels unusual, because it maintains a level of consistency that stands out. And that consistency keeps the question active, because it challenges immediate classification. The scale of the pattern also contributes to its effect, because it is not limited to a small section. It extends across the surface, creating a repeated design that continues beyond a single point, reinforcing the sense of order. And that repetition adds weight to the observation, because it shows that the pattern is not isolated. It is part of the entire surface. The texture of the rock adds another layer, because the raised lines in lower sections create variation in depth, forming a surface that is not flat but structured, giving the pattern a physical presence that can be felt as well as seen. And that physicality enhances the impression of design. But interpretation remains open, because while the pattern looks engineered, the processes that could create it are still considered within natural explanations, meaning that the appearance alone is not enough to define its origin. And that is where the uncertainty remains, because it shows how visual similarity can influence perception, how something that looks designed may still be natural. Even now, when the rock is observed, the reaction is immediate, because the pattern is clear, recognizable, and that recognition connects it to familiar forms. But familiarity does not always mean origin. And that distinction is important, because it separates appearance from explanation. The rock remains, the pattern unchanged, the grid still visible, and that persistence allows for continued observation, continued discussion, because it exists as a clear example of something that challenges expectation, something that sits between categories, not fully explained by appearance alone, but not fully outside natural explanation either. And maybe that is what makes Waffle Rock stand out. Not because it proves something unusual, but because it shows how natural processes can create forms that feel structured, forms that resemble design, forms that challenge how we interpret what we see. A surface that looks engineered, but exists as part of the natural world. And that contrast, the skulls that were said to have horns, the horned skulls of Sayre. At first it sounds unlikely. Human skulls with horns. Not symbolic, not carved, not decorative, but physical extensions emerging from the bone itself. Something that doesn't fit within normal human anatomy, something that immediately raises doubt. And that reaction is natural, because the claim itself challenges expectation. This is often referred to as the horned skulls of Sayre. And what makes it stand out is not just the description, but the story surrounding it. Because the account describes a discovery where multiple skulls were reportedly found with horn-like structures, creating a situation that feels difficult to place within known biological variation. And that is where the question begins. Because before explanation, there is the claim. And the claim must be examined carefully. The idea of horn-like growths on a human skull is not entirely without context, because bone can abnormalities. Growths can form. Conditions can alter structure in ways that appear unusual. But these are typically irregular, not symmetrical, not consistent across multiple individuals. And that difference matters, because the reports describe more than one example. And repetition changes the nature of the claim. But documentation becomes important here, because without preserved physical evidence that can be directly examined today, understanding relies on records, on descriptions, on reports that may vary in detail and accuracy. And that introduces uncertainty, because secondary information is not the same as direct observation. The context of the discovery is also part of the discussion, because the skulls were reportedly found in a burial setting, suggesting that they were part of a structured environment, not isolated anomalies, but associated with a group or location that had its own system of burial. And that connection raises another question. If the Yi'ad features were real, how were they understood by the people who lived at that time? Were they considered normal, significant, or something else entirely? But without clear records from that context, the interpretation remains open. The shape of the reported horns also matters, because the description suggests extensions from the skull, not separate objects, not attachments, but part of the bone itself, which would require biological explanation rather than cultural modification, and that increases the complexity, because it moves the discussion into anatomy, into conditions that could produce such features. But known conditions do not typically produce symmetrical, horn-like structures across multiple individuals in a consistent way. And that creates tension between possibility and probability. At the same time, the absence of widely available, verifiable specimens makes it difficult to confirm the claim in a direct, measurable way, and that limitation is important. Because it means that the discussion remains in a space where evidence is incomplete, where interpretation relies on what is reported rather than what is consistently available for study. Even so, the story persists because it represents something that challenges expectation, something that does not fit easily into known categories, something that invites curiosity. And that persistence keeps it relevant, because it continues to be referenced, discussed, questioned. But the key detail remains the difference between observation and verification, because a claim can exist, but without consistent, verifiable evidence, it remains open. And that openness defines the subject, because it places it in a space where it cannot be fully accepted or fully dismissed without further evidence. And that balance is important, because it shows how interpretation depends on what can be confirmed. Even now, the idea of the horned skulls continues to appear in discussions of unusual discoveries, not as a confirmed category, but as a reported anomaly, something that sits at the edge of what is understood. And maybe that is what makes the horned skulls of Sayre stand out. Not because they are fully explained, but because they represent a claim that challenges expectation, a report that suggests something unusual, but remains incomplete in terms of evidence, a description that exists without full confirmation. And that uncertainty is what remains. The cavities carved into rock that show signs of heat, tiger cave kilns. At first, it doesn't look like a place of production, just openings cut into rock, shallow at the entrance and extending inward, forming spaces that feel like caves, but with shapes that appear more deliberate than natural formations, suggesting that these were not simply found, but created. And that first impression is important, because it places the site somewhere between natural and constructed. These are often referred to as the Tiger Cave kilns. And what makes them stand out is not only their shape, but the evidence of use, because the interiors show signs that suggest exposure to heat, surfaces that appear altered, indicating that something happened within these spaces beyond simple shelter. And that introduces function, because heat changes material, it leaves traces, and those traces can be observed. The cavities themselves are carved into stone, not built with separate materials, but shaped directly into the rock, creating enclosed environments that can contain temperature, making them suitable for processes that require controlled heat. And that suitability suggests intention, because carving into rock to create such spaces requires effort, time, and planning. The size of the cavities varies, some larger, some smaller, creating a range of spaces that could serve different purposes or reflect different stages of development, indicating that the site was not created in a single uniform phase. And that variation adds depth, because it shows that the system may have evolved over time. The surfaces inside these cavities show changes, darkening, alteration, patterns that are consistent with exposure to sustained heat, suggesting that the interiors were used repeatedly, that whatever process took place here was not temporary, and that repetition matters, because it indicates ongoing use, a system rather than a single event. The arrangement of the cavities also reflects planning, because they are positioned in ways that suggest awareness of space, spacing between openings, alignment along the rock face, creating a layout that is not random. And that organization suggests coordination, because placing multiple cavities in a structured way requires consideration of how they interact, how they are accessed, how they function together. The term kiln suggests a specific interpretation, a place used for firing materials, possibly ceramics, or other substances that require high temperatures, and that interpretation aligns with the evidence of heat. But the exact use is not fully defined, because while the signs of heat are clear, the materials that were processed may not always be preserved, and that creates uncertainty, because it leaves part of the function open. The location of the site also contributes to understanding, because being carved into rock provides insulation, helping retain heat, making the environment more stable, which is important for processes that require controlled conditions. And that practical aspect supports the idea of deliberate use. But there are still questions, because while the structure suggests function, the full system, how it was operated, what materials were used, how the process was organized is not completely preserved. And that gap remains between structure and full understanding. Even now, the cavities remain, the shapes still visible, the signs of heat still present, allowing the site to be studied, observed, interpreted. And that persistence keeps the subject active, because it provides physical evidence even if the full context is not complete. The interaction between carving and use is also significant, because it shows how natural material was shaped to create a controlled environment, how the rock itself became part of the system, not just as structure, but as function. And that integration reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders were not working against the material, they were using it, adapting it. But interpretation still varies, because without complete evidence, different explanations remain possible, different uses, different processes. And that variation keeps the discussion open. And maybe that is what makes the Tiger Cave kilns stand out. Not because their function is entirely unknown, but because their structure clearly shows use, clearly shows intention, while still leaving room for interpretation about the exact nature of that use. A space carved into stone, marked by heat, shaped by repeated activity, and still not fully defined. And that trace is what remains. The circular pyramids that break the pattern, guachimontons. At first, they don't look like pyramids. There are no sharp triangular sides, no single peak rising in a familiar form, only wide circular platforms that expand outward in layered rings, creating a shape that feels different from what we usually associate with monumental structures. And that difference is immediate, because most large ancient constructions follow predictable geometry. But this does not. These are the Guachimonton circular pyramids, and what makes them stand out is not just their shape, but how consistently that shape is repeated. Because multiple structures follow the same circular design, forming a pattern that is deliberate rather than experimental. And that consistency suggests a system. Each structure is built in concentric layers, circular platforms rising gradually toward the center, creating a stepped formation that does not direct the eye upward to a point but inward toward a central space. And that inward focus changes the experience, because instead of emphasizing height, the design emphasizes center. The materials used are stone and earth, combined to create stable platforms that maintain their shape over time, forming structures that are durable enough to remain visible even after long periods. And that durability reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders knew how to work with available materials to achieve the form they intended. The central area of these structures is often open, a space that is not occupied by a solid mass but left accessible, suggesting that the focus of the structure may not have been the platform itself, but what happened at the center. And that introduces function, because it suggests that these were not simply static monuments. They were spaces of activity. The surrounding layout adds another layer, because the circular pyramids are not isolated. They are part of a larger settlement pattern, connected to other structures, open areas, pathways, forming a system that integrates the pyramids into a broader environment. And that integration reflects planning, because it shows that the pyramids were part of a larger design, not separate from it. The repetition of the circular form across different sites suggests that this was not a single construction idea, but a shared architectural concept, something that was understood, reproduced, and maintained across multiple locations. And that level of consistency requires knowledge, because it shows that the builders were following a model. The shape itself also raises questions, because circular construction on this scale is not the simplest approach. It requires careful alignment, maintaining curvature, ensuring that each layer follows the form accurately. And that effort suggests intention, because choosing a circular design over simpler forms indicates that the shape itself was important. The surrounding features, such as platforms, smaller structures, and open spaces, suggest that these pyramids were part of a system of use. possibly connected to gatherings, events, or activities that required space and organization. But the exact nature of those activities is not fully preserved, and that leaves interpretation open, because while the structure suggests use, the full context is not completely known. The orientation of the pyramids also shows consistency, because they are aligned in ways that suggest awareness of space, positioning within the landscape, creating a relationship between structure and environment. And that relationship reflects planning, because it shows that placement was not random. Even now, the forms remain, the circular layers still visible, the central spaces still defined, allowing the structures to be studied, to be observed, to be experienced, and that persistence keeps the subject active, because it provides clear evidence of a design that is different from what we usually expect. The contrast with more familiar pyramid forms is what makes them stand out, because they show that monumental construction does not follow a single pattern, that different cultures develop different approaches, different forms, different ways of shaping space, and that variation adds depth to understanding. But there are still questions, because while the design is clear, the full meaning behind it is not completely preserved. The reason for the circular form, the exact use of the central space, the purpose of repetition across sites, all of these remain partially unknown. And that uncertainty is part of the structure, because it shows that even when the form is visible, the full explanation can remain open. But the evidence is strong. The layout, the repetition, the design, all of it shows intention, planning, execution. Because these are not accidental formations. They are constructed, deliberate, consistent, and maybe that is what makes, and maybe the Guachimontones stand out, not because they are larger, but because they are different. A pyramid that does not rise to a point, but expands in circles. A structure that focuses inward rather than upward. And that difference is what remains. The stones that look cut beyond their purpose. Ishi no Hoden and Masuda no Ewafune. At first, they don't look like ruins. There are no walls, no collapsed structures, no clear remains of a larger building, only massive stone forms that sit alone, shaped in ways that immediately suggest intention, but without the surrounding context that would normally explain them. And that isolation is what stands out, because these are not fragments, they are complete. This includes Ishi no Hoden and Masuda no Iwafune, two stone structures in Japan that share a similar quality, both carved directly from rock, both shaped with flat surfaces and sharp edges, both presenting forms that feel deliberate, but without a clearly defined function. And that combination raises questions, because when something is carefully shaped, there is usually a purpose that can be traced. But here, the purpose is not immediately clear. Ishi no Hoden appears as a massive block of stone, cut in a way that creates flat planes and right angles, giving it a geometric form that contrasts with the surrounding natural rock. And that contrast is important, because it shows that the shape is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate cutting. The structure is partially surrounded by water, and that adds another layer, because it creates the impression that the stone is floating even though it remains connected to the ground beneath, changing how it is perceived, altering its visual impact. And that interaction with water may not be incidental, because it suggests that placement and environment were considered. Masuda no Iwafune presents a different form, a large elevated stone block with carved features on its surface, including flat planes and indentations that suggest shaping beyond simple extraction, creating a structure that feels unfinished in some areas, but still clearly worked. And that sense of incompleteness adds complexity, because it raises the question of whether the structure was left unfinished or whether the visible form represents the intended design. The scale of both structures is significant, because removing this amount of stone requires effort, time, coordination, indicating that these were not small projects, but undertakings that required planning. And that level of effort suggests importance, because large-scale work is usually connected to significant purpose. The surfaces of the stones show signs of cutting. Flatness, defined edges, indicating that tools were used to shape the rock, to remove material in a controlled way, creating forms that are consistent across different parts of the structure. And that consistency reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders had methods, techniques, ways of achieving the shapes they intended. But what those shapes were meant to represent or support is not fully clear, because there are no clear attachments, no visible connections to other structures, nothing that directly indicates how these stones were used within a larger system. And that absence creates uncertainty, because it leaves the structures isolated in meaning as well as in form. Some interpretations suggest that they may have been part of larger plans, foundations, bases, structures that were never completed. Others suggest symbolic or ritual significance, but none of these explanations fully account for all aspects, and that keeps the question open. The location of these stones also matters, because they are positioned in environments that interact with the landscape, integrated into their surroundings rather than placed separately, suggesting that location was part of the design, and that integration reflects planning, because it shows that the builders considered not only the shape of the stone, but where it would exist. Even now, the structures remain. The surfaces still visible, the shapes still defined, allowing them to be studied, observed, questioned, and that persistence keeps the subject active, because it provides physical evidence even if the full explanation is not complete. The contrast between precision and uncertainty is what defines these structures, because they are clearly shaped, clearly intentional, yet their purpose remains unclear. And that combination creates tension, because it shows that understanding form does not always lead to understanding function. And maybe that is what makes Ishi no Hoden and Masuda no Iwafune stand out. Not because they are the largest, but because they are complete in form yet incomplete in explanation. Massive stones, carefully shaped, standing alone, and still not fully understood. And that silence is what remains. The stone walls that fit without gaps, ancient walls of South America. At first, they seem impossible to simplify. Walls made of stone rising across landscapes, forming boundaries, terraces, and structures that appear stable, deliberate, and clearly constructed. Yet what stands out is not just their presence, but how the stones fit together. Because there are no obvious gaps, no visible mortar, only stone against stone, joined so tightly that even small openings are difficult to find. And that precision is what draws attention. These are the ancient stone walls of South America, found across different regions, often associated with highland environments where terrain is uneven and conditions can be challenging, yet the structures remain stable, holding their form over long periods. And what makes them different is not just their durability, but the method of construction. Because instead of using uniform blocks, many of these walls are made from stones of different shapes, each one cut and adjusted to fit with the others. And that method changes everything, because irregular shapes are harder to work with. They require adjustment, refinement. Each stone must be shaped individually to match the surrounding pieces, creating a system where every element is unique, yet still part of a consistent whole. And that requires understanding, because fitting irregular stones together without gaps means that the builders had to anticipate how each piece would connect, how pressure would distribute, how stability would be maintained. The surfaces of the stones show evidence of shaping, edges that have been refined, faces that align closely with adjacent stones, creating joints that are tight enough to resist movement, contributing to the overall strength of the wall. And that tightness is not only visual, it is functional, because reducing gaps increases stability, allowing the structure to handle stress more effectively. The walls are often built on slopes, uneven terrain, and yet they remain aligned, following the contours of the land while maintaining structural integrity, showing that the builders were not forcing a design onto the environment, but adapting the design to fit the landscape. And that adaptation reflects planning, because it shows that the builders understood how to work with the terrain rather than against it. The scale of some of these walls is also significant. Large stones, heavy, requiring effort to move and position, suggesting that construction involved coordination, multiple individuals, a system of work that allowed these materials to be handled effectively. And that coordination indicates organization, because moving and placing large stones is not a simple task. It requires planning, timing, control. The absence of mortar is a key feature, because it means that the stability of the wall depends entirely on the placement of the stones, on how well they fit together, on how weight is distributed across the structure. And that reliance on placement reflects precision, because there is no binding material to compensate for errors. Each stone must be positioned correctly. The variation in stone size also adds to the structure. Smaller stones filling spaces between larger ones, creating a system where gaps are minimized, where each piece contributes to the overall stability, forming a network of connections rather than a simple stack. And that network is what holds the structure together. Even now, many of these walls remain standing, intact, despite environmental factors, despite time, showing that the construction methods were effective, that the design allowed for long-term stability. But there are still questions, because while the method is visible, the exact techniques used to shape and position the stones are not always fully understood. The tools, the processes, the sequence of construction, all of these remain partially unknown. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it shows that even when the result is clear, the process behind it may not be fully preserved. The visual effect of these walls is also striking, because the irregular shapes create patterns that feel organic, yet controlled. A balance between variation and order that reflects both the material and the method. And that balance is part of what makes them recognizable. But beyond appearance, the function of these walls varies. Some serve as boundaries, others as terraces, others as part of larger structures. And that variation shows that the method was adaptable, applied in different contexts to achieve different purposes. And maybe that is what makes these walls stand out, not because they are the tallest, but because of how they are built, how irregular stones come together to form something stable, something precise, something that holds without additional support. A structure defined by fit, by connection, by balance, and precision is what remains. The rock split with unusual precision, Al-Nasla rock formation. At first, it looks like a simple division, a large rock formation separated into two parts, standing side by side with a narrow gap between them, something that could be explained as natural cracking, something that happens over time in many environments. But the closer you look, the more controlled it appears, because the split is clean, extremely clean. A straight vertical separation that runs through the stone in a way that feels precise, almost as if it follows a line that was defined before the rock was divided. And that precision is what draws attention. This is Al-Nasla, and what makes it stand out is not just the fact that it is split, but how it is split, because the separation appears smooth, consistent, without the irregular edges that are often associated with natural breaks. And that creates a contrast, because natural fractures tend to vary. They shift, they create uneven surfaces, but here, the division appears controlled, almost even. The two halves of the rock also stand balanced, each part resting on a smaller base, creating the impression that they are supported in a way that maintains their upright position, adding to the visual effect, making the structure appear stable despite the separation. And that balance adds another layer, because it suggests that the current form is not only about the split, but about how the pieces remain positioned afterward. The surface of the rock shows natural weathering, erosion patterns, textures that reflect exposure to environmental conditions over time, indicating that the formation has been shaped not only by the initial split, but by ongoing processes that affect the outer layers. And that combination creates complexity, because it shows that multiple processes are involved. The environment where the rock is located plays a role, desert conditions, temperature variations, wind, all contributing to rock changes over time, influencing both the formation of cracks and the smoothing of surfaces. And these factors can create fractures. They can shape rock in ways that appear structured, but the straightness of the split remains unusual, because maintaining a consistent line through such a large mass is not common in natural formations. And that is where the discussion begins, because it places the formation in a space where natural explanation is possible, but the visual appearance continues to raise questions. The scale of the rock adds to the effect, because the larger the formation, the more noticeable the precision becomes, the more the straightness stands out against the expectation of irregularity. And that amplifies the observation, because it makes the difference more visible. The base of the rock also contributes to the structure, because each half stands on a narrower support, creating a shape that appears almost staged, even though it is part of the natural formation, adding to the sense that the structure is balanced in a way that feels deliberate. And that perception is important, because it influences how the formation is interpreted. The presence of carvings on the surface adds another detail, markings that indicate human interaction with the rock at some point, showing that the formation was noticed, engaged with, possibly given significance. And that interaction connects the natural formation to human activity. But the carvings themselves do not explain the split. They are separate elements, added later. And that distinction matters, because it separates natural formation from human modification. Even now, the rock remains, the split unchanged, the two halves still standing, creating a form that continues to attract attention, continues to be observed, studied, discussed. And that persistence keeps the question active, because the formation is clear, visible, but not fully agreed upon in terms of explanation. And maybe that is what makes Al Nazla stand out. Not because it defies natural processes, but because it presents a result that feels more precise than expected. A formation that looks controlled, even if it was created through natural means. A clean division across a massive stone, and that precision is what remains. The stone tower is built for the dead, Silistani's chulpas. At first they look like towers, tall cylindrical structures rising from the ground, standing against the open landscape, with a shape that feels controlled and deliberate. Not natural, not accidental, but clearly constructed. And that first impression is accurate, because these are not random formations. They are built. This is Silistani. And what makes it stand out is not just the presence of these towers, but how they were designed. Because these structures, known as chulpas, are not meant for the living. They are burial towers, spaces created to hold the remains of individuals within a system that reflects both construction and belief. And that combination is important, because it connects architecture with purpose. The towers are cylindrical, but not perfectly straight. Some widen slightly toward the top, creating a subtle outward curve that changes the profile, making the structure feel heavier above than below, which is unusual compared to most constructions. And that shape suggests intention, because altering the form in this way requires planning. The stones used in these structures are carefully shaped, fitted together with precision, creating surfaces that are smooth, aligned, forming walls that appear stable and controlled, showing that the builders had methods for shaping and placing stone effectively. And that precision reflects understanding, because it shows that the construction was not improvised. It followed a system. The entrances to the chulpas are small, often facing a specific direction, creating controlled access to the interior, indicating that movement into the structure was limited, intentional, not open or unrestricted. And that control reflects purpose, because it shows that the space was meant to be accessed in a particular way. Inside, the space is enclosed, designed to hold remains, creating a contained environment that separates what is inside from what is outside, reinforcing the function of the structure as a place of burial rather than habitation. And that separation is significant because it defines the role of the structure. The placement of these towers across the landscape also matters because they are positioned in visible locations, often elevated, allowing them to be seen from a distance, suggesting that visibility was part of their design, that they were meant to be part of the environment, not hidden within it. And that visibility adds meaning, because it shows that the structures were not only functional, but also symbolic. The repetition of these towers across the site creates a pattern. Multiple structures, similar in form, grouped within the same area, indicating that this was not a single construction, but a system, a practice that was repeated over time. And that repetition reflects continuity, because it shows that the method was sustained, used across generations. The environment, though, around Silistani also contributes to the experience. Open land, expansive views, a setting that emphasizes the presence of the towers, allowing them to stand out against the landscape, reinforcing their visual impact. And that interaction with the environment reflects planning, because it shows that location was chosen with awareness. But there are still questions, because while the function as burial structures is clear, the full context, the specific practices associated with these towers, the exact processes of use, are not fully preserved. And that leaves space for interpretation, for understanding that is partial rather than complete. The construction techniques also raise questions, because the precision of the stonework suggests skill, methods that allowed the builders to achieve alignment and stability, even when working with heavy materials. And that skill reflects knowledge, because it shows that the builders understood how to work with stone at a high level. Even now, the towers remain, standing, visible, their form still intact, allowing them to be studied, observed, experienced. And that persistence keeps the subject active, because it provides clear evidence of construction, even if the full meaning behind it is not completely preserved. The contrast between function and form is what stands out, because these are burial structures, yet they are built with care, with precision, with attention to how they appear, suggesting that they were meant to be more than simple containers. They were meant to be seen. And maybe that is what makes Silistani's chulpas stand out. Not just because they hold the remains of the past, but because of how they were built to represent something beyond that, something that connects structure, landscape, and purpose into a single form. Stone towers, standing in open space, holding what is no longer visible. And that presence is what remains. The faces carved into stone that still watch the ocean, Easter Island statues. At first, they don't feel real. Massive stone figures standing across an isolated island facing outward in silence, their expressions fixed, their forms consistent, as if they were placed with intention rather than left behind by time. And that stillness is what draws attention, because they are not scattered randomly. They are positioned deliberately. These are the Easter Island statues, and what makes them stand out is not just their size, but their presence, because each statue represents a figure, a face carved with detail, with proportion, with a level of consistency that suggests a shared method, a system that was followed again and again. And that repetition matters, because it shows that these were not individual experiments. They were part of a process. Each statue is carved from stone, shaped into a human-like form with elongated heads, defined features, and bodies that extend downward, often partially buried, creating the impression that only part of the figure is visible above ground. And that partial visibility changes perception, because it makes the statues feel larger than they appear at first glance. The carving itself shows control. Smooth surfaces, defined edges, features that are repeated across multiple statues, indicating that the builders had a clear idea of the form they wanted to create and the ability to reproduce it. And that ability reflects knowledge, because shaping stone at this scale requires technique, patience, and coordination. The size of the statues varies. Some smaller, others significantly larger, requiring more effort to carve, more effort to move, suggesting that the process was not limited to a single scale, but adapted depending on the structure being created. And that variation adds depth, because it shows that the system was flexible. But what stands out is not only how they were made, but where they are placed, because many of these statues face inland, toward the island, rather than toward the ocean. And that orientation suggests intention, because it indicates that the focus was not outward, but inward, toward the land, toward the space where people lived. And that direction raises questions, because it suggests that the statues were positioned to observe something specific, to face a particular environment rather than the surrounding sea. The platforms they stand on also matter, because they are not placed directly on the ground, but elevated on structures that support them, creating a base that adds height, stability, and presence, and that combination of statue and platform forms a complete system, because it shows that placement was part of the design. The process of moving these statues also adds another layer, because the stone used to carve them is not always found where the statues stand, meaning that after carving, they had to be transported across landscape, requiring methods that are not fully preserved, and that introduces uncertainty, because moving objects of this size requires coordination, planning, techniques that are not immediately visible in the remaining evidence. The environment of the island also contributes to their preservation. Open land, exposure to wind and weather, conditions that have shaped the surfaces over time, but not erased the forms, allowing the statues to remain visible, recognizable. And that persistence keeps the subject active, because it allows continued observation, continued study. But there are still questions, because while the statues are clearly constructed, clearly placed with intention, the full meaning behind them, the exact purpose they served, the system they were part of, is not completely preserved. And that leaves space for interpretation. Some see them as representations, others as markers. But no single explanation fully accounts for all aspects, and that uncertainty is what defines them, because it shows that even when the structure is visible, the full context can remain incomplete. The scale of the statues also adds to their impact, because their size changes how they are experienced, creating a sense of presence that is not just visual but spatial, something that occupies the landscape in a way that is difficult to ignore. And that presence is part of their function, because it suggests that they were meant to be seen, to stand, to remain. Even now, they continue to face the land, unmoving, unchanged in form, maintaining the same position they were given. And maybe that is what makes the Easter Island statues stand out. Not just because they are large, but because they are consistent, repeated, placed with intention, forming a system that is visible, yet not fully explained. Stone figures. Watching. Across time. And that presence is what remains. The tomb that was hidden so well, it was never found, lost tomb of Genghis Khan. At first it feels like it should be easy to find, a ruler of immense power, a figure who controlled vast territories, commanded armies across continents, and left a mark on history that is still studied today. Someone like that should have a tomb, a location, a structure that marks where they were laid to rest. But in this case, there is nothing. No confirmed site, no visible structure, no single place that can be identified with certainty. And that absence is what makes this different. This is the mystery of the lost tomb of Genghis Khan. And what makes it stand out is not just who it belongs to, but the fact that despite centuries of searching, despite modern technology, despite continuous interest, the exact location remains unknown, and that raises a question. Because something this significant does not disappear easily, unless it was meant to. Historical accounts suggest that the burial was intentionally hidden, that those involved in the process ensured that the location would not be revealed, that the site would remain undiscovered, not just temporarily, but permanently. And that intention changes everything, because it means that the absence is not accidental, it is deliberate. The descriptions vary. Some suggest that the burial took place in a remote area. Others describe efforts taken to erase all traces of the site after the burial was completed, removing any visible markers that could lead back to it. And that level of concealment reflects planning, because hiding something effectively requires understanding how it might be found. The landscape associated with the search is vast. Open terrain, mountains, regions where natural features are extensive, where distinguishing one location from another is difficult without clear markers. And that complexity adds to the challenge, because it creates an environment where something can exist without being easily identified. The idea of burial itself also matters, because while many cultures mark burial sites with structures, monuments, or visible indicators, in this case, the lack of such markers suggests a different approach, one that prioritizes secrecy over visibility. And that difference reflects intention, because it shows that the purpose was not to display, but to conceal. The scale of the empire adds another layer, because it shows that the resources available would have allowed for complex processes, for coordinated efforts, for actions that could ensure that the burial site remained hidden. And that capability supports the idea that concealment was achievable. But even with modern methods, the site has not been confirmed. Searches have been conducted, areas explored, but no definitive location has been established. And that persistence of uncertainty is what defines the mystery, because it shows that even with increased knowledge, some questions remain unresolved. The absence of physical evidence creates a different kind of presence, because instead of a structure to study, there is a gap, a missing location, something that is known to exist in concept, but not in confirmed form. And that gap becomes the focus, because it shifts attention from what is visible to what is not. The stories surrounding the burial also contribute to the mystery. Accounts of secrecy, of actions taken to prevent discovery. And while not all details can be verified, they reflect a consistent idea that the location was meant to remain hidden. And that idea is supported by the outcome, because it has not been found. The passage of time adds another layer, because landscapes change. Markers disappear. Natural processes alter the environment, making identification even more difficult, especially when no clear reference points were left behind. And that change increases uncertainty, because it means that even if the site were located, it might not appear as expected. Even now, the search continues. Not always in direct ways, but through study, through analysis, through attempts to narrow down possibilities. And that ongoing effort shows that the question is still active, because it has not been resolved. But maybe that is what makes this stand out. Not because the tomb is visible, but because it is not. A burial of immense importance, hidden with intention, protected by secrecy, and still not found. A place that exists without a location. And that absence is what remains. The mummy that doesn't follow the rules. Unknown man E. At first it looks like any other mummy. A preserved body, wrapped, placed within a burial context, part of a system that has been studied for decades. Something that fits within what we already understand about ancient burial practices. But then the details begin to shift, because this one is different. This is often referred to as unknown man E. And what makes it stand out is not just its condition, but how it was treated, because the methods used here do not align with the standard practices that were carefully followed in other burials of the same period. And that difference raises questions, because burial in this context was not random. It followed rules, procedures, steps that were repeated with precision. And when something breaks that pattern, it becomes noticeable. The position of the body is one of the first details, because it appears constrained. The posture not fully relaxed, not arranged in the controlled way typically seen, creating an impression that the individual was not placed in a calm, ordered position. And that creates tension, because it contrasts with the expectation of careful preparation. The facial expression also draws attention, because it appears open, almost as if caught in a moment, rather than arranged afterward, giving the impression of something unresolved, something that was not fully controlled during the process. And that impression adds to the mystery. The wrapping itself is different, because instead of the refined materials often used, this individual was wrapped in what appears to be less typical material, suggesting a deviation from standard practice, indicating that the process was altered. And that alteration matters, because it shows that the treatment was not the same. The absence of certain expected steps is also noticeable, because typical preservation methods involve specific processes, removing internal elements, preparing the body in a consistent way. Yet here, some of those steps appear incomplete or different, suggesting that the process was either rushed, altered, or intentionally changed, and that introduces possibility, because it suggests that the burial may have been handled differently for a reason. The identity of the individual is not fully confirmed, and that adds another layer, because without a clear identity, the context becomes more difficult to define, leaving the interpretation open. But what is clear is that this was not a typical burial. The conditions surrounding the body suggest something unusual, because the combination of position, wrapping, and preservation methods creates a pattern that does not align with the expected standard. And that pattern is what defines the subject. The location also matters, because being found in a place associated with significant burials suggests that this individual was not entirely separate from the system, but still connected to it in some way. And that connection raises questions, because it suggests that the individual had a place within the context, even if the treatment was different. The interpretation of this case varies. Some focus on the unusual features, the deviations. Others attempt to place it within known explanations, suggesting that the differences may be the result of specific circumstances. But no single explanation fully resolves all aspects, and that keeps the discussion open. Even now, the mummy remains, preserved, visible, allowing for continued study, continued analysis, because it provides physical evidence that can be examined. But examination does not always lead to complete answers, because interpretation depends on context, on comparison, on how different pieces of information are connected. And those connections are not always complete, and that incompleteness is what defines this case, because it leaves space for different explanations, for continued discussion, for perspectives that evolve over time. The contrast between expectation and reality is what stands out most, because this is a burial that should follow a pattern, but does not. And that break in pattern is what creates the question, because it shows that even within structured systems, there can be exceptions, moments where the process changes, where something different occurs, and maybe that is what makes Unknown Man E stand out. Not because it provides clear answers, but because it presents a case where the usual rules do not apply, where the structure is present but altered, where the process is recognizable but incomplete. A preserved body within a known system, but treated differently, and that difference is what remains.